Let's talk about rendering the fat cap on your brisket. If you get it wrong, you'll get a hard white fat cap that your guests might just peel off and throw away. If you get it right, you'll get an ooey-gooey brown and sweet fat cap that melts in your mouth. But what's the best way to achieve that brisket fat cap perfection? We're gonna find out in this video, so let's get smoking. Welcome to the Smoke Lab. I'm Steve Gow, and on this show I do crazy barbecue experiments you would never do at home, so you can learn from my trial and error. Rendering the brisket fat cap. What does that actually mean? Well, at its most basic level, it means cooking the fat cap until it's at least soft and squishy enough to be edible. The fat cap may be solid white, but as long as it's soft enough to melt in your mouth, I consider that to be rendered. But if we take it a bit further, whether that's a higher cooking temperature or a longer cook time or both, the fat cap starts to brown and caramelize and actually starts to taste a lot sweeter. I would also consider that kind of fat cap to be rendered. And then we could take it even further to where the fat cap renders down so much that it fully integrates with the meat below and it has a slight crunchy, bacony texture and flavor. Again, I would also call that rendered. So there's a spectrum, and personally I prefer it when there's a little bit of browning on top of the fat cap to bring out that sweetness, and there's a little bit of that soft white fat underneath, and it's super soft so you can kind of slurp it up, almost like you're slurping up an oyster. But regardless of how we would define rendering, I think we can all agree that hard white fat is undesirable and we want to avoid that. So how do we avoid that and get more delicious rendering? First, don't wrap too early. When a brisket's fully unwrapped, its surface temperature can get much higher, which allows the fat cap to render down faster and achieve that brown caramelly sweet texture. When we wrap it, we trap a lot of moisture at the surface of the fat cap, which means it can never get above the boiling point of water, which is just 212 degrees, depending on where you live and your elevation. Where I live, it's 208 degrees because I'm quite high. Well, not right now. I mean, I'm high in elevation. Think of it like boiling versus frying a slice of bacon. If we boiled a slice of bacon, we would only be cooking it at 212 degrees maximum, and it would get soft, but it would also be pale. The fat wouldn't taste very good. It definitely wouldn't be crunchy. But if we fried the bacon, it would get to temperatures of like 300 degrees plus in the pan. It would get very well rendered and brown, and the fat would taste sweet, and it would also be crunchy. It's kind of like that with brisket. When it's unwrapped, it's kind of like we're air frying the brisket, and the surface temperature can get much higher and we can get more rendering. But if we wrap it, then it's kind of like we're boiling the surface of the brisket in its own water vapor. So what's one way of getting more rendering on a fat cap? Simply take it longer in the cook before you wrap it. Let's say you like to wrap in foil or butcher paper midway through the cook. Maybe instead of wrapping at 165, take it all the way to 185 before wrapping it, so you can get more fat cap rendering before you wrap it. Or better yet, you could just wrap it in a foil boat, which is what I do often these days because I still preserve moisture that way, but I leave the fat cap exposed, so I continue to render the fat cap all the way to the end of the cook. Second, you can use oil as a binder or even spray it on the fat cap later on in the cook. I did an experiment where I cooked briskets with several different binders, mustard, mayonnaise, and oil. And I found that the oiled brisket actually had a better rendered fat cap at the end of the cook. When the brisket gets to a certain point in the cook, the fat cap starts to render and melt, if you will, and it starts to actually fry in its own fat. And that liquid fat on top of the fat cap actually helps it render down because again, it can get to a much higher temperature, up to 400 degrees Fahrenheit, as opposed to the boiling point of water, which is just 212 degrees if we fully wrap it. That liquid fat is really critical to helping the fat cap render, so it's unsurprising that if we add liquid fat to the fat cap of the brisket, somehow it's going to help with the rendering, whether by using it as a binder. You could use vegetable oil, you could use liquid beef tallow, any kind of liquid fat will work, or you can spray it on the brisket later in the cook. I got one of those little pump oil misters, and I preheated some tallow so it's nice and hot, put it in there, not so it's like boiling, so it's going to melt all the internals, but 140 degrees is where it's still liquid enough to spray, and then I pump it up and I spray it onto the brisket fat cap later on in the cook. And I have been known in a pinch to also just use Pam if I want more rendering later in the cook and the fat cap is still really hard. I'll just hit it with some Pam, to be honest. It doesn't really affect the flavor that much, and it does help with rendering. Third method, take your briskets to a higher internal finishing temperature. Now, I had a hypothesis that the higher higher the internal temperature of the brisket gets, the higher the surface temperature will get, which will facilitate rendering. To test it out, I smoked a brisket and made slices of the point and flat at various internal temperatures to see how the fat cap renders as temperature increases over time. When I trimmed this brisket, I kept the fat cap much thicker than the 1/4 inch that I typically cook it because I wanted to see a visible difference. At 180 degrees internal, the fat cap of the point was thick and white on the bottom with a brown and caramel color closer to the bark, but not very pronounced. When I felt it, it was slightly stiff, but it was starting to get soft. In contrast, the fat cap on the flat was still thick white and bouncy at 180. I would consider it not edible, which I think is because I cooked the brisket with a point towards the fire with all of the airflow going up over top of it and missing the fat cap. So that's an important reminder to rotate my brisket periodically throughout the cook so the flat is towards the firebox at least part of the time so it cooks more evenly and actually gets some rendering. At 195 internal, I temped the surface of the point and it was around 200 degrees, no higher than the boiling point of water. So what I suspect is happening here is all the water still retained in the brisket at this low internal temperature is kind of wicking away that surface level temperature, whether it's through evaporative cooling or it's acting as a heat pipe and piping in that heat from the surface to the internal water that's still in the brisket. One of those two reasons, but either way, it's inhibiting the surface level temperature, which is preventing us from getting better rendering. When I sliced into the point at 195, the fat was still white on the very bottom, which is unsurprising because it was around 1/2 inch thick, but the top 1/4 inch is now very brown and squishy. In contrast, the flat fat cap looks pretty much the same as it did when it was at 180 internal, so again, good reason to rotate your briskets. Finally, at 203 degrees internal, I temped the surface of the point again, and it was around 230 degrees or higher, which is well above the boiling point of water. So I think this shows by taking it to a higher internal temperature, we've sweated out more moisture. It's allowing the surface temperature of the fat cap to get much higher and basically fry in its own fat, an air fry. When I sliced into it at 203 degrees, the point had a crispy fried outer layer and the fat is brown and rendered almost all the way down to the meat. It's almost like there's just a thin, squishy bacon layer on top, and you can see how easily I can poke through it with no bounce back. I think if I had originally trimmed this down to a 1/4 inch like I normally do, the fat cap would be rendered all the way down to the meat. Next, I put the brisket and the slices in my holding oven at 150 for 18 hours to see if the fat cap would continue to render down during that long hold period. Now, one of the final results that I wanted to look at for this experiment is how the brisket actually turned out after my standard 18 to 20 hour hold period in my holding oven. Did the fat cap get any more rendered during that period? How did the 180 versus 195 versus 203 slices that I took compare to each other? Did they get any more squishy? Are all the slices edible? That's what I'm gonna look at now. All right, so there's our brisket, and here's all of our slices that we made. This was the very tip of the flat. Give you guys a look there. It looks juicier than when it went in, and the fat cap looks a little bit more rendered. Actually, it looks about the same. It just has some browning on it, but let's see if we can squish it. I mean, it squishes easily. It's very good. I'd still eat it. Totally. That's more than enough rendering for me. It's not the best. It's not like that ooey-gooey, caramelly rendering, bacony flavor that you get when it's fully rendered down. Still really good though, so it just goes to show taking a brisket to around 180, you might just get enough rendering just doing that. So then the next slice we can look at here, just moving inward, is this one. This would be the 195. So pretty well rendered, a little bit more rendered, I'd say. It's looking pretty good. And then the final one, this would be the 203 flat slice. This actually looks really nice. And it does actually, if you dig into it a little bit, it has some of that brown rendering on it. And it's sweet, it's tasty, it's very good. So it did get a little bit more rendering on the flat. And then moving on to the point, this would be the first slice that we took at 180. And you can see it's really good rendering on the point. The point did really well. Oh yeah. Very sweet, very rendered down. And then the next slice we have would be this one. This fat cap was a little bit thicker in this area, so you can see that has a ton of fat. Just the outer layer got really well rendered, but if we dig into it, you can see that it's all edible still. It's still really good. And I would not remove that from the slice before I ate it. It's not hard white fat. And the very exterior, kind of crunchy and bacony. This is the last slice. This would be the 203 slice. You can see how it's really well rendered on the fat cap. Very squishy. I think that's kind of the gold standard for a brisket. It's almost just disintegrates into nothing. Oh my God. And it tastes so good. That's the best tasting fat cap out of all these 3 slices. For all these slices, even the 180 slices, the fat cap is still rendered enough to be edible, but the higher temperature ones are just more rendered, they're more bacony, they're sweeter, they're just better. In conclusion, what's the best way to render the fat cap on your briskets? Well, I don't think there is one best way, but there's several methods you can use to help it along. You can leave your brisket longer unwrapped, you can cook it at a higher temperature, or you can cook it to a higher temperature, or you could use some sort of liquid fat or oil as a binder or spray it on the fat cap later on during the cook. All of these things will help you to prevent that hard, unrendered white fat that nobody really likes, and a lot of my guests have just peeled that off whenever I get those results, and more towards that ooey-gooey, brown, fully rendered, sweet, caramelized, bacony fat cap that everybody loves. Don't forget to subscribe to the Oklahoma Joe's YouTube channel. I will see you in the next video, and until then, happy smoking.